I think it is imperative that we come together on this floor and that we pass the Save America Act and make certain that we know who is voting and that they are a citizen.
Hey, what's up? Welcome to the Learing Tree. Get your pencil and paper ready. Class is about to begin. Voting is one of the most fundamental rights of American citizenship. But here's something strange. Americans don't even agree on what you should have to prove before casting a ballot. 36 states currently request or require some form of identification at the polls. 14 states and Washington, D.C. don't require voters to present any identification documents at all. And now Congress is considering something much bigger, the Save America Act. It would establish nationwide requirements involving proof of citizenship when registering for federal elections and photo ID when voting in them. Supporters call that common sense election security. Opponents say it would make voting unnecessarily difficult for legitimate American citizens. So who's right? Today on the Learing Tree, we're going to read the legislation, look at voter fraud, examine the voter ID laws across all 50 states, revisit the accusations of voter suppression and racism, and find out finally what the evidence actually tells us. No slogans, no assumptions. Let's start with the law. So what exactly is the Save America Act? SAVE, if you didn't know, is an acronym. It stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. At its core, the proposal would establish new nationwide rules for federal elections involving two separate things that are often confused: proving citizenship when registering to vote and proving identity when actually voting. Under the proposal, people registering for federal elections would generally have to provide documentary proof of the United States citizenship. That could include documents such as a U.S. passport, qualifying birth certificate, or naturalization documentation, depending on the circumstances. Then, when voting in person in a federal election, voters would generally be required to present an accepted form of photo identification. The legislation also contains requirements affecting mail and absentee ballots, along with procedures for provisional ballots and accommodations for certain voters. But there's something extremely important to understand. Non-citizens are already prohibited from voting in federal elections. The Save America Act isn't creating that prohibition. The debate is about how the government should verify citizenship and identity before allowing someone to participate in a federal election. And here's where the legislation stands right now. The House passed the current Save America Act legislation earlier this year. But as of this recording, the Senate has not passed it, and it has not become federal law. The Senate actually left Washington for its August recess without approving the measure, so the fight over the legislation is still ongoing. Welcome to the Learing Tree.
My name is Justin Papp. I cover politics for CNBC. So the initial version of the SAVE Act that Chip Roy introduced and Mike Lee introduced in the Senate in late January would have required some form of ID at the ballot box that proved you were an American citizen, so something like a passport, for instance. There's an amended version of the SAVE Act that was introduced over the weekend that pares that back a little bit. Some form of photo ID would still be required.
And that's really where the disagreement begins. Supporters say this is basic election security. If federal elections are limited to American citizens, the government should verify citizenship rather than simply relying on an applicant's word. Opponents respond that illegal voting is already illegal, and requiring additional documents could make registration more difficult for legitimate American citizens who don't readily have those documents.
Why would they think we don't have ID?
Those are policy arguments. But the Save America Act also leads directly into a much older American argument. Should you have to show identification to vote? And this is where things get controversial, because voter ID isn't hypothetical. Most states already have some form of it, but critics have also argued that voter ID requirements discriminate against minority voters.
That's just stupidity, honestly.
With some politicians comparing modern day elections to Jim Crow. But let's forget both talking points for a minute. Let's look at the map. This is what voter identification actually looks like across America. According to the National Conference of State Legislators, 36 states currently request and require voters to show some sort of identification at the polls. The remaining 14 states and Washington, D.C. don't require voters to present an identification document at the polls, although they still verify voters through other methods. And there's another distinction that's important. Voter ID doesn't always mean photo ID. Some states require or request photographic identification. Others accept certain non-photo documents. And states also differ in what happens if you arrive without acceptable identification. That's why simply coloring America red for ID and blue for no ID doesn't tell the whole story. Take Texas as an example. Texas is a voter ID state and accepts several forms of photo identification, but even here the law isn't simply no driver's license, no vote. There are procedures available for certain registered voters who have a reasonable impediment to obtaining one of the primary forms of identification. That's important because when we debate voter ID, the details of the individual law matter. What identification counts? How can someone obtain it? And what happens if they don't have it? Now we've reached probably the most controversial part of this entire discussion, the argument that voter ID laws aren't merely convenient or unnecessary, but racist. Rather than have me characterize that argument, let's hear it directly.
The 21st century Jim Crow assault is real. It's unrelenting. And we're going to challenge it vigorously. While this broad assault against voting rights is not unprecedented, it's taking on a new and literally pernicious forms. It's no longer just about who gets to vote or making it easier for eligible voters to vote. It's about who gets to count the vote. Who gets to count whether or not your vote counted at all.
Do you have an opinion on voter ID laws?
Yeah, they're usually pretty racist. I think voter ID laws are a way to perpetuate racism.
Do you think it suppresses the African American vote?
Definitely.
Tell us how.
Because they're less likely to have state IDs.
Do you have ID normally? You carry ID around?
Yes, I have state ID.
Do you carry ID?
Yes, I do.
Do you know any black person who doesn't carry ID?
No.
Everybody that I know have ID. Like, that's one of the things you need to walk around with New York with.
You can always get IDs. You can do it over the internet. Does that also make it difficult for black people in particular?
Yeah, you have to have access to the internet. You have to be able to pay an internet service provider for certain fees.
I think that's harder for black people to go online.
Well, I feel like they don't have the knowledge of how it works.
And I also heard a lot that black people, especially poor black people, have no access to the internet, can't figure out how to use the internet.
That's just stupidity, honestly. Everybody has access to the internet. Even a little kid can figure out how to work the internet.
Minority voters are less likely to have the kinds of IDs that have been described or required.
Everyone that I know has an ID. Why would they think we don't have ID?
That's a lie. Why would they say that?
Do you have ID?
Yes.
These type of people don't live in areas with easy access to DMVs or other places where they can get identification.
For most of the communities, they don't really know what is out there just because they're not aware or they're not informed.
Maybe a little bit of racist in it, but like I said, I think it's more stupidity and ignorance.
You're judging somebody, you're judging them because they black, saying that they don't got it.
These type of people.
What people are they talking to? Who are these people talking to?
I heard a lot also that black people can't figure out how to get to the DMV.
Really?
What does that say to you?
I know it's that, but on 25th Street.
Welcome to the Learing Tree. Now, those interviews are interesting, but they're also anecdotes. A handful of people interviewed on the street cannot scientifically establish whether voter ID discriminates against millions of Americans. So let's move past the street interviews. What does the actual evidence say? Research on voter identification is much more nuanced than political slogans suggest. Studies have examined whether these laws change turnout, whether effects differ among demographic groups, and whether campaigns and voters adapt to the requirements. The evidence doesn't justify treating every voter ID law as identical. A strict requirement with difficult to obtain documentation isn't necessarily equivalent to a state that provides free identification and multiple alternatives. In other words, the meaningful question isn't simply, does this state have voter ID? It's, What ID does it accept? How accessible is that ID? And what happens when an eligible voter doesn't have it? So whatever you think of voter ID as public policy, support for the basic concept isn't confined to one political party. Large majorities of Americans support requiring government-issued photo identification to vote. That doesn't solve every argument over how much a law should work, but it does put the political debate into perspective.
If you plan on traveling, we need your help to prevent delays and to prove your identity. Get a real ID. Starting May 7th, you will need a real ID to travel by air or to visit federal buildings in the United States.
Identity verification itself certainly isn't unusual in American life. We encounter it when flying, applying for passports, establishing employment eligibility, driving, conducting certain financial activities, and accessing certain secure facilities. But there is an important distinction. Voting is a constitutional political right. So saying I need ID to board an airplane, therefore voter ID must be good, that doesn't actually settle the issue. The relevant point is narrower. Verifying someone's identity is already an ordinary part of American society. The debate is whether requiring it at the polls provides reasonable election security without creating unreasonable barriers for eligible voters. And finally, voter fraud. Here's another subject where two things can be truly simultaneous. Voter fraud exists. It does. People have been investigated, prosecuted, and convicted for election crimes. But acknowledging individual cases does not establish that widespread fraud routinely determines American elections. And voter fraud isn't one single crime. In-person impersonation, double voting, illegal non-citizen voting, registration fraud, mail ballot offenses, and vote buying are all different things. An administrative mistake isn't automatically fraud either. Fraud requires intentional wrongdoing, so the factual position isn't fraud never happens. And it isn't because fraud exists, elections must be filled with it. The evidence has to determine the conclusion. And now we can finally come back to where we started, the Save America Act. The proposal goes further than the voter ID systems currently used by individual states. It would establish federal requirements involving documentary proof of citizenship for voter registration and identification requirements for federal voting. Supporters believe those requirements would strengthen election integrity and public confidence. Opponents believe they would impose unnecessary burdens on eligible American citizens when illegal non-citizen voting is already prohibited. And right now, that's still a debate over proposed legislation because the Save America Act has not become federal law. So after all that, here's what we actually know. Most states already have some form of voter identification requirements. Americans overwhelmingly support the general concept of photo voter ID. Fraud does exist, but individual cases aren't evidence of widespread election fraud. And the Save America Act would go way beyond many existing state systems by creating a new federal citizenship documentation and identification requirement. Whether those additional requirements represent necessary election security or unnecessary barriers is ultimately a policy decision. But now you actually know what the proposal says and how voter identification works across America. You decide. And let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed your time at the Learing Tree, please consider subscribing to my channel. Like and share this video, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Peace.